You know those moments when life decides to show you exactly who holds the real power in this world? When someone looks at you and thinks they can erase your existence with a single dismissive glance? Well, let me tell you about the day I walked into Meridian Couture on Fifth Avenue and watched an entire luxury empire crumble in less than 6 minutes. The day I went from being treated like an unwelcome intruder to the woman who restructured one of America's most prestigious fashion houses from the ground up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Simone Washington, and at 32 I had already carved out a reputation that most people spend decades building. But none of that seemed to matter when I stepped through those gleaming glass doors on what should have been one of the most important days of my career. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Manhattan. The October air carried that crisp bite that makes you feel alive, energized, ready to conquer whatever the day might throw at you. I had been up since 4:30, not because I had to be, but because my mind was already racing with the possibilities ahead. This wasn't just another business meeting. This was the culmination of 18 months of negotiations, market research, and strategic planning that would either elevate my consulting firm to unprecedented heights or serve as an expensive lesson in overreach. My apartment on the Upper West Side buzzed with that familiar energy of a woman preparing for battle. Not the kind of battle you see coming, mind you, but the kind that finds you when you least expect it. I had chosen my outfit carefully that morning. A tailored navy blazer from an up-and-coming designer I discovered in Brooklyn, paired with perfectly fitted trousers and the kind of understated jewelry that spoke of success without screaming it from the rooftops. My natural hair was styled in an elegant twist that had taken my stylist 45 minutes to perfect the day before. Washington Strategic Consulting wasn't just another firm in a city full of consultants. We specialized in something most people couldn't even pronounce properly: algorithmic market penetration for luxury brands. Sounds complicated, right? It was. And it was also revolutionary. While other consultants were still playing with basic demographic data and focus groups, my team and I had developed something that was quietly changing how the world's most exclusive brands understood their customers. We called it the Prestige Analytics Platform, a sophisticated system that could predict consumer behavior in the luxury market with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. The platform didn't just tell you who was buying your products. It told you who was going to want to buy your products 6 months before they even knew it themselves. It could identify emerging trends in luxury consumption, predict which celebrity endorsements would actually move merchandise, and most importantly for our clients, it could spot the exact moment when a luxury brand was about to lose its exclusivity appeal. My background wasn't typical for someone running a high-end consulting firm in Manhattan. I had grown up in Oakland, California, raised by a grandmother who cleaned offices in downtown San Francisco and a mother who worked double shifts at a department store just to keep food on our table. But what we lacked in money, we made up for in ambition and intelligence. My grandmother, Rosa Washington, had been born in Alabama during the height of segregation. She used to tell me stories about walking past the fancy department stores in Birmingham as a child, pressing her face against the windows to look at clothes she knew she'd never be allowed to try on, let alone purchase. "Simone," she'd say, settling into her favorite chair after another 14-hour day of cleaning other people's offices, "someday you're going to walk into those fancy stores, and they're going to jump over themselves to help you. But you remember where you came from, baby. You remember who couldn't even look in those windows." Those stories shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. They instilled in me a fierce determination to not just succeed, but to succeed so completely that no one could ever question my right to be in any room, any store, any boardroom I chose to enter. I had earned my undergraduate degree in applied mathematics from Stanford, where I was one of only 3 black women in my graduating class. From there, I went straight to MIT for my PhD in computational economics, focusing specifically on predictive modeling in consumer markets. My dissertation, Algorithmic Prediction of Luxury Brand Consumption Patterns in Emerging Demographics, had been published in 3 major academic journals and was being used as a reference text in business schools across the country. But academic success was just the foundation. What really set me apart was what happened after I left MIT. While my classmates were rushing off to work for established consulting firms or tech giants, I had a different vision. I wanted to build something that hadn't existed before, a consulting firm that specialized exclusively in the luxury market, using cutting-edge technology to understand consumer behavior at a level that traditional market research couldn't touch. The first 2 years were brutal. I worked out of a shared office space in Soho, living on ramen noodles and coffee, pouring every dollar I had into developing the Prestige Analytics platform. I hired 3 brilliant programmers, all of them young, hungry, and willing to work for equity instead of immediate payment. Together, we created something that the luxury industry had never seen before. Our first major client was a boutique jewelry brand in Los Angeles that was struggling to understand why their sales had plateaued. Within 6 weeks, our platform had identified a shift in their target demographics' purchasing patterns and recommended a complete repositioning strategy. Their sales increased by 230% in the following quarter. Word spread quickly in the insular world of luxury brands. Within a year, we were consulting for fashion houses in Paris, jewelry designers in New York, and high-end hospitality brands in Miami. Our client list read like a who's who of aspirational living, brands that defined what it meant to have made it in modern America. By the time that October morning rolled around, Washington Strategic Consulting had grown to a team of 15 specialists working out of a beautifully appointed office in Midtown Manhattan. We were generating 7 figures in revenue annually, and I had been featured on the cover of Business Insider as one of 30 under 35 entrepreneurs reshaping American commerce. But success in business is one thing. Walking into the rarefied world of ultra-luxury retail as a young black woman is something else entirely. Meridian Couture wasn't just another high-end fashion store. It was an institution. Founded in 1952 by Italian immigrant Giuseppe Meridian, the store had become synonymous with exclusivity, impeccable taste, and the kind of prices that made even wealthy people pause. Located on 5th Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets, occupying 3 floors of prime Manhattan real estate, Meridian Couture catered to a clientele that included Hollywood royalty, tech billionaires, and old money families whose names adorned hospital wings and university buildings. The store's reputation was built on more than just expensive merchandise. It was built on an experience, the feeling that by shopping there, you weren't just buying clothes, you were joining an exclusive club. The sales associates were trained to make customers feel like they were being personally styled by fashion royalty. The private shopping suites on the 3rd floor offered champagne, fresh flowers, and the kind of personalized attention that made spending $50,000 on a single outfit feel reasonable. This was the world I was about to enter, not as a customer, but as a potential partner. The meeting had been arranged through Marcus Chen, Meridian Couture's chief financial officer, whom I had met at a luxury retail conference in Las Vegas 6 months earlier. Marcus was a brilliant man in his early 50s, who had earned his MBA from Wharton and had been instrumental in expanding Meridian Couture's presence beyond New York. He understood that the luxury retail landscape was changing rapidly and that brands that failed to adapt would find themselves irrelevant within a decade. Our initial conversations had been promising. Marcus had seen the success stories from our other clients, and he was intrigued by the possibility of using our Prestige Analytics platform to help Meridian Couture expand into new markets while maintaining their reputation for exclusivity. The numbers we had presented were compelling. Our data suggested that Meridian Couture could increase their revenue by 40% over the next 3 years by making strategic adjustments to their customer targeting and inventory selection. But Marcus had made it clear from the beginning that any partnership would need the approval of the store's owner and creative director, Isabella Meridian Rothschild. Giuseppe Meridian's granddaughter had inherited the business when she was just 28, and over the past 15 years, she had transformed it from a successful regional boutique into a global luxury brand. Isabella was known for being brilliant, demanding, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting the Meridian Couture brand. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning. Marcus had arranged for us to meet in Isabella's private office on the 3rd floor, followed by a tour of the store's operations and a working lunch where we would present our detailed proposal. If everything went well, we would be walking out with a signed contract for a 2-year consulting engagement worth $1.2 million. As I stepped out of the taxi on 5th Avenue, I felt that familiar surge of confidence that had carried me through every major challenge in my career. The morning sun was reflecting off the store's pristine windows, creating an almost ethereal glow around the mannequins displaying the latest collections. Pedestrians hurried past, most of them not even glancing at the merchandise that cost more than many people's annual salaries. I paused for a moment before entering, taking in the scene. This was more than just a business meeting. This was my grandmother's granddaughter, Walking through the front door of the kind of store Rosa Washington had only been able to admire from the outside. This was validation of every late night, every risk, every moment of doubt that had brought me to this point. The store's entrance was flanked by two massive floral arrangements, white orchids and roses that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. The brass door handles were polished to a mirror shine, and the store's logo, an elegant script M surrounded by a laurel wreath, was etched into the glass with the kind of precision that spoke of European craftsmanship. I checked my watch. 9:47 a.m. Perfect timing. Early enough to show respect for the appointment, but not so early as to seem overeager. I had learned long ago that in the world of luxury business, perception was everything. Every detail, from the timing of your arrival to the way you carried yourself, was being evaluated and cataloged. The anticipation was electric. Everything I had worked for, over the past 5 years, was about to be put to the test. This wasn't just about landing another client. This was about proving that a young black woman from Oakland could walk into the most exclusive retail environment in America and be recognized as an equal, as a valuable partner, as someone worthy of respect. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my briefcase, and reached for the polished brass handle. The next few hours would either validate everything I had built or teach me a lesson about the limits of achievement in a world that still judged people by the color of their skin before they ever heard the brilliance of their ideas. The door opened with the whisper-quiet precision of German engineering, and I stepped into a world where I was about to discover that success, intelligence, and preparation weren't always enough to guarantee the respect I had earned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of Meridian Couture was nothing short of breathtaking. As I stepped across the threshold, my feet sank slightly into the carpet so plush it felt like walking on clouds. The scent hit me immediately, a carefully curated blend of French lavender, Italian leather, and something indefinably expensive that seemed to whisper luxury with every breath. Crystal chandeliers cast warm, golden light across displays that looked more like art installations than retail spaces. Each section of the ground floor was designed as its own intimate boutique. Cashmere scarves draped artfully over antique wooden displays, handbags positioned on marble pedestals like museum pieces, jewelry cases that belonged in the Louvre rather than a department store. Everything was positioned with the kind of precision that suggested someone had spent hours considering the exact angle of each display, the perfect spacing between items, the optimal lighting to make everything seem to glow from within. But what struck me most wasn't the merchandise or even the opulent decor. It was the atmosphere of reverence that permeated the space. Customers moved through the store with the hushed respect typically reserved for cathedrals or libraries. Sales associates glided between displays like ghosts, appearing at exactly the right moment to offer assistance, then disappearing just as smoothly when their help wasn't needed. This was the world I had been preparing to enter for the past 18 months, not just as an observer, but as a strategic partner. The Meridian Couture account represented more than just another client. It was the key to establishing Washington Strategic Consulting as the premier luxury market consulting firm in North America. Marcus Chen had been clear about the scope of what they were looking for. Meridian Couture wanted to expand their customer base without diluting their brand exclusivity, perhaps the most delicate balancing act in luxury retail. They had identified 3 specific growth opportunities: expanding their presence in emerging luxury markets like Austin and Nashville, developing a more sophisticated digital presence that maintained their high-end appeal, and creating a next-generation customer experience that would attract younger, affluent consumers without alienating their established clientele. Our Prestige Analytics platform was perfectly positioned to address all 3 challenges. Over the past 6 months, my team had conducted extensive research specifically for this presentation. We had analyzed purchasing patterns from 17 different luxury brands, conducted focus groups with high-net-worth individuals across 12 metropolitan areas, and developed predictive models that could identify luxury consumption trends up to 18 months in advance. The data we had uncovered was fascinating and, frankly, revolutionary. Traditional luxury retail operated on assumptions that were rapidly becoming obsolete. The old model assumed that luxury consumers were primarily motivated by exclusivity and status signaling. Our research revealed something far more complex and interesting. The emerging luxury consumer, particularly those between the ages of 28 and 45 with household incomes above $300,000, made purchasing decisions based on what we called experiential authenticity. They weren't just buying products, they were buying stories, experiences, and connections to craftsmanship and heritage. They wanted to feel like they were part of something exclusive, but they also wanted to understand and appreciate the artistry behind what they were purchasing. This insight had led us to develop what we called the heritage experience model. Instead of simply displaying merchandise, luxury retailers could create immersive experiences that told the story behind each piece. A handbag wasn't just a handbag. It was the result of 3 generations of Italian craftsmen perfecting their technique. A watch wasn't just a timepiece. It was a piece of mechanical art that represented hundreds of hours of precision engineering. We had tested this model with 2 of our existing clients, and the results were remarkable. Chateau Beaumont, a luxury jewelry boutique in Beverly Hills, had implemented our recommendations and seen their average transaction value increase by 67% within 4 months. More importantly, their customer retention rate had jumped from 31% to 78%. The second success story was even more impressive. Platinum Reserve, an exclusive men's clothing store in Chicago, had been struggling to attract younger customers without alienating their established base. Using our heritage experience model, they had redesigned their store layout and sales approach. Within 6 months, they had successfully attracted customers in the 25 to 40 age demographic while actually increasing satisfaction scores among their traditional clientele. But the Meridian Couture project was different. It wasn't just about implementing proven strategies. It was about pioneering new approaches that could set the standard for luxury retail across the industry. Isabella Meridian Rothschild wasn't looking for incremental improvements. She wanted transformational change that would position Meridian Couture as the definitive luxury retail experience for the next generation. My briefcase contained 3 separate presentation folders, each tailored to a different aspect of our proposed partnership. The first focused on market expansion opportunities. Our analysis had identified 7 metropolitan areas where Meridian Couture could establish new locations with minimal risk of brand dilution. Each location had been selected based on a complex algorithm that considered local income demographics, existing luxury retail presence, cultural attitudes toward high-end consumption, and projected economic growth. Austin, Texas, for example, had emerged as an unexpected opportunity. The city's rapid growth in the technology sector had created a new class of young millionaires who were actively seeking ways to signal their success through luxury purchases. However, the existing luxury retail options in Austin were limited and generally focused on more accessible luxury brands. Meridian Couture could establish itself as the premier destination for ultra-high-end fashion in the Southwest. The second presentation folder contained our digital strategy recommendations. This was perhaps the most delicate aspect of the entire proposal. Meridian Couture had always prided itself on providing an intensely personal, exclusive shopping experience. The idea of selling their merchandise online, or even maintaining a significant social media presence, had been considered antithetical to their brand values. But our research had revealed that even ultra-luxury consumers were increasingly expecting seamless integration between digital and physical retail experiences. The key was creating digital touchpoints that enhanced rather than replaced the personal service that defined the Meridian Couture experience. We had developed a concept we called Digital Concierge, a sophisticated online platform that functioned more like a private membership club than a traditional e-commerce site. Potential customers would need to apply for access, providing information about their style preferences, lifestyle, and purchasing history. Once approved, they would be paired with a personal stylist who could provide recommendations, arrange private shopping appointments, and even coordinate outfit selections for specific events. The platform would never display prices publicly or allow for traditional online purchasing. Instead, it would serve as a sophisticated communication tool that allowed customers to browse selections, request appointments, and maintain ongoing relationships with their personal stylists. The actual purchasing would still take place either in-store or through private consultations. The third folder contained what I considered our most innovative proposal, the Heritage Artisan Program. This concept would transform Meridian Couture from a retail store into a cultural institution. The program would invite master craftsmen from around the world to spend residencies at the store, creating custom pieces and educating customers about traditional techniques. Imagine walking into Meridian Couture and finding a master shoemaker from Florence handcrafting bespoke footwear in a glass-walled atelier on the second floor. Or watching a master jeweler from Antwerp setting stones in a custom engagement ring. Customers wouldn't just be buying finished products, they would be participating in the creation process, understanding the artistry and skill that went into each piece. The program would also include exclusive events, private dinners with renowned designers, educational workshops on topics like understanding cashmere quality or the art of watchmaking, and even curated cultural experiences that connected fashion with broader artistic traditions. Our financial projections suggested that the Heritage Artisan program alone could increase Meridian Couture's revenue by 25% within the first year, primarily through increased customer engagement and higher average transaction values. But more importantly, it would position Meridian Couture as something unique in the luxury retail landscape, a destination that offered not just products, but education, experience, and connection to authentic craftsmanship traditions. The elevator to the third floor was a work of art in itself, polished brass panels with hand-etched botanical designs that caught the light as we ascended. I had arrived 15 minutes early, as planned, and Marcus Chen had met me personally at the reception desk on the ground floor. His warm smile and firm handshake had immediately put me at ease. Marcus was exactly the kind of executive I enjoyed working with, someone who understood both the creative and financial aspects of luxury retail. During our previous conversations, he had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of market trends and consumer psychology. More importantly, he had shown genuine enthusiasm for the innovative approaches our firm was known for. "Isabella is looking forward to meeting you," he said as the elevator climbed smoothly upward. "She's reviewed all the preliminary materials you sent, and she's particularly intrigued by your heritage experience model concept. I should warn you, though, she's going to challenge everything. That's just her style. She believes that the best ideas emerge from rigorous questioning." I appreciated the heads up. Some consultants might have been intimidated by the prospect of facing tough questions from a notoriously demanding client. For me, it was energizing. I had spent months preparing for this presentation, and I was confident that our research and recommendations could withstand any level of scrutiny. The third floor of Meridian Couture was a completely different world from the retail spaces below. Here, the atmosphere was more like an exclusive private club than a commercial environment. The elevator opened into a reception area furnished with antique Persian rugs and furniture that looked like it belonged in a European palace. Original oil paintings, not prints or reproductions, but actual paintings by artists whose names I recognized from museum visits, adorned the walls. Isabella Meridian Rothschild's office occupied the corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided stunning views of Central Park to the west and the bustling Fifth Avenue corridor to the south. The space managed to be both intimidating and welcoming, clearly the office of someone with impeccable taste and significant power, but arranged in a way that invited collaboration and discussion. As we waited for Isabella to finish a phone call, Marcus briefed me on the final details of our presentation timeline. We would have 90 minutes for the formal presentation, followed by a tour of the store's operations, including the private shopping suites and the behind-the-scenes areas that customers never saw. Then we would have lunch in Isabella's private dining room, where we could discuss implementation timelines and contract details. "One more thing," Marcus added, lowering his voice slightly. "Isabella places enormous importance on first impressions. She believes that you can tell everything you need to know about a person in the first 60 seconds of meeting them. She's usually right." I nodded, feeling that familiar surge of confidence that always accompanied high-stakes situations. First impressions were something I had been managing successfully my entire career. From my days as the only black woman in most of my graduate school classes, to my early meetings with potential clients who had never worked with a consulting firm led by someone who looked like me, I had learned to project competence, professionalism, and expertise from the moment I walked into a room. My preparation for this meeting had been exhaustive. I had studied Isabella's background, her design philosophy, her previous public statements about luxury retail trends, and even her personal style preferences. I had researched the history of Meridian Couture, understanding not just their business model but their cultural significance within the fashion industry. More importantly, I had prepared for every possible objection or question she might raise. Why should an established luxury brand risk changing their successful formula? How could we guarantee that expansion wouldn't dilute their exclusivity? What evidence did we have that our digital strategies wouldn't cheapen their brand image? How could they maintain their reputation for personalized service while serving a larger customer base? I had answers, detailed, data-driven, thoroughly researched answers, for all of these questions and dozens more. This wasn't just about winning a client. It was about demonstrating that Washington Strategic Consulting had evolved into something truly special, a firm that could partner with the most prestigious brands in the world and deliver transformational results. The phone call ended. Through the glass partition, I could see Isabella Meridian Rothschild gesturing expressively as she concluded what appeared to be a passionate discussion about fabric sourcing. In just a few moments, I would be walking into that office to present the culmination of everything I had built over the past 5 years. Everything was ready. The presentations were flawless, the research was bulletproof, and I was prepared for whatever challenges might emerge. What I couldn't have prepared for was the lesson I was about to learn about the difference between earning respect and being granted it, between professional competence and social acceptance, between success in the boardroom and survival on the retail floor. Isabella Meridian Rothschild was everything I had expected and nothing I had prepared for. When she emerged from her office, extending a perfectly manicured hand in greeting, I immediately understood why she had become such a formidable force in the fashion industry. She possessed that rare combination of intellectual sharpness and aesthetic sophistication that marked true visionaries in the luxury space. Standing about 5'6" in her signature Louboutin heels, Isabella moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been raised in environments where every gesture mattered. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a chignon that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent to maintain, and her charcoal gray suit was so perfectly tailored it seemed to have been painted onto her frame. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, pale green, intensely focused, and clearly accustomed to seeing things that others missed. "Dr. Washington," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of the Italian accent she had inherited from her grandfather. "Marcus has been singing your praises for months. I'm looking forward to understanding how your approach might complement our vision for Meridian Couture's future." The handshake was firm, professional, and lasted exactly the right amount of time. Everything about the interaction suggested someone who had mastered the subtle dance of executive communication. As we settled into the seating area of her office, a conversation space arranged around a coffee table that was probably worth more than my first car, I felt the familiar thrill of engaging with a truly sophisticated client. Our conversation began exactly as I had anticipated. Isabella was well prepared, having clearly studied the preliminary materials we had submitted. Her questions were incisive, demonstrating both broad strategic thinking and deep knowledge of luxury retail operations. She understood the challenges facing traditional luxury brands in an evolving marketplace, and she was genuinely intrigued by our research findings. "The concept of experiential authenticity is fascinating," she said, leaning forward slightly as I walked her through our heritage experience model. "We've always believed that luxury is fundamentally about storytelling, but your research suggests we've been telling the wrong stories." "Not wrong," I corrected gently, "but incomplete. Your customers already understand that they're buying quality and exclusivity. What they're hungry for is connection to the artisans, to the traditions, to the cultural heritage that makes each piece meaningful." Isabella nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been handcrafted in Florence. "The Heritage Artisan program is particularly compelling. We've discussed similar concepts internally, but never with this level of strategic framework. The financial projections are impressive, but I'm more interested in the brand positioning implications." For 45 minutes, we engaged in exactly the kind of high-level strategic discussion that energized me. Isabella challenged every assumption, questioned every projection, and pushed me to defend concepts from angles I hadn't initially considered. It was intellectual sparring at its finest, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the process of refining and strengthening our proposals through her scrutiny. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first. A slight change in Isabella's posture, a different quality to her attention. I realized she was no longer looking directly at me when she spoke. Instead, her gaze was drifting toward the windows, toward Marcus, anywhere but making direct eye contact. Your digital strategy recommendations are interesting, she said, though her tone had lost some of its earlier enthusiasm. Though I wonder if you fully understand the unique challenges of maintaining brand exclusivity in digital spaces. The question itself wasn't problematic. It was exactly the kind of concern I had anticipated and prepared for. But something in her delivery felt different. There was a distance that hadn't been there moments earlier, a subtle shift from collaborative partner to skeptical evaluator. I think that's precisely why our approach is different from traditional e-commerce strategies, I responded, launching into a detailed explanation of how our digital concierge concept maintained exclusivity through controlled access and personalized service. We're not talking about putting your merchandise on a website for anyone to browse. We're creating a digital extension of the personalized experience that already defines Meridian Couture. Isabella's response was polite but perfunctory. She asked a few follow-up questions, but they felt more like going through the motions than genuine engagement. The intellectual curiosity that had marked the first part of our conversation seemed to be evaporating. Marcus, I noticed, was beginning to look uncomfortable. He kept glancing between Isabella and me, as if trying to understand what had changed in the room's dynamic. During our previous meetings, he had been enthusiastic about every aspect of our proposal. Now he seemed uncertain, hesitant to jump in with the kind of supportive commentary he had provided earlier. "Perhaps we should take that tour now," Isabella suggested, checking an expensive watch that I recognized as a limited edition Patek Philippe. "I find that seeing our operations firsthand often provides valuable context for strategic discussions." As we prepared to leave her office, I felt a growing unease that I couldn't quite identify. The meeting had started so well, with exactly the kind of sophisticated dialogue I had hoped for. Isabella had demonstrated genuine interest in our concepts and had engaged with our research at a level that suggested real partnership potential. But something had shifted, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly when or why. The elevator ride to the second floor was notably quieter than our earlier ascent had been. Isabella stood slightly apart from Marcus and me, studying her phone with the kind of intense focus that people use when they want to avoid conversation. Marcus made a few attempts at small talk about the store's recent renovation, but his comments felt forced and received only minimal responses. The second floor of Meridian Couture housed their private shopping suites, 6 beautifully appointed rooms where their most valued customers could browse merchandise in complete privacy. Each suite was designed as a luxury apartment, complete with sitting areas, full-length mirrors, and private changing rooms. Fresh flowers were replaced daily, and customers could request anything from champagne and strawberries to a full catered meal while they shopped. Our private clients typically spend between $15,000 and $40,000 per visit, Isabella explained as we toured the first suite. The average session lasts about 3 hours, and we maintain detailed profiles of each client's preferences, sizes, and purchase history. The suite we were touring was currently being prepared for a client appointment later that afternoon. 2 sales associates, both impeccably dressed women who looked like they could have stepped off the pages of Vogue, were arranging a selection of evening gowns on padded hangers. Each dress was a work of art, from a midnight blue Valentino that seemed to capture starlight in its beading, to a crimson Oscar de la Renta that managed to be both elegant and dramatic. "Ute, Mrs. Patterson is attending a charity gala next weekend," one of the associates explained to Isabella. "We've selected pieces that complement her coloring and figure, and we've arranged for alterations to be completed by Thursday." Isabella nodded approvingly, but I noticed she didn't introduce Marcus and me to the associates. In fact, she seemed to be positioning herself between us and the women, as if creating a barrier. It was such a subtle gesture that I might have missed it if I hadn't spent years learning to read the unspoken dynamics of business interactions. The tour continued through the other suites, each one showcasing a different aspect of Meridian Couture's approach to luxury retail. The attention to detail was extraordinary, from the handcrafted furniture to the museum-quality lighting that made every piece of clothing look like it belonged in a gallery. But I was becoming increasingly aware of a pattern in Isabella's behavior. When we encountered store employees, she would introduce Marcus by name and title, acknowledging him as a valued member of the executive team. When it came to me, the introductions became vague and truncated. "This is Dr. Washington," she would say, with no explanation of who I was or why I was touring their facilities. Sometimes she skipped introductions entirely, simply continuing with her commentary as if I weren't there. The most telling moment came when we visited the store's alteration department. tucked away in a corner of the second floor that customers never saw. This was where master tailors worked their magic, adjusting couture gowns and custom suits to achieve perfect fits. The head tailor, a distinguished man in his 60s who had clearly been with the store for decades, looked up expectantly when we entered his workspace. "Antonio," Isabella said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Chen, our chief financial officer." She then gestured toward me but said nothing, creating an awkward pause that stretched just long enough to be noticeable. Antonio, clearly uncomfortable with the incomplete introduction, extended his hand toward me with a questioning look. "Antonio Benedetti," he said, "head of alterations." "Dr. Simone Washington," I replied, shaking his hand and forcing a professional smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but it crystallized something that had been building throughout the tour. Isabella wasn't just becoming less engaged with our proposals. She was systematically minimizing my presence and expertise. What had started as a collaborative business meeting was morphing into something else entirely. As we moved through the ground floor retail space, I began to notice other subtle signs of the shift in Isabella's attitude. Sales associates who had been warm and welcoming when I first arrived now seemed uncertain about how to interact with me. There were sideways glances, hesitant smiles, and the kind of careful politeness that people use when they're not sure of someone's status or authority. The most unsettling moment came when we paused near the jewelry counter, where a sales associate named Jennifer was helping a customer select a necklace. The customer, an elegant woman in her 40s, was considering a stunning diamond piece that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. "The craftsmanship is exquisite," Jennifer was explaining, holding the necklace up to catch the light. "Each diamond is hand-selected and individually set using techniques that date back to the 19th century. Isabella watched the interaction approvingly, then turned to Marcus and me. "This is exactly the kind of educational experience that our customers value," she said. "Jennifer has been with us for 8 years, and she's become an expert in fine jewelry history and craftsmanship." But as she spoke, I noticed her eyes weren't on Marcus or me. They were scanning the store, and I could see her taking in details that hadn't been visible from her third-floor office. The clientele browsed the merchandise, the interactions between customers and sales staff, the overall atmosphere and energy of the retail environment. And then I realized what had been bothering me since we left her office. From Isabella's elevated perspective on the third floor, surrounded by the rarefied atmosphere of executive suites and private dining rooms, our conversation had remained on the level of abstract strategy and sophisticated analysis. But now, standing on the sales floor among the actual customers and merchandise, she was seeing me in a different context. On the third floor, I had Dr. Simone Washington, successful entrepreneur and strategic consultant. Down here, in the world of luxury retail, where image and perception shaped every interaction, I was something else entirely. I was a young black woman in a space where the overwhelming majority of both customers and staff looked nothing like me. The realization hit me with uncomfortable clarity. Isabella hadn't changed her mind about our proposals or my qualifications. What had changed was her awareness of how my presence might be perceived by her customers, her staff, and the carefully cultivated atmosphere of exclusivity that defined Meridian Couture's brand. As we concluded the tour and prepared to return to the third floor for our lunch meeting, I felt the weight of a familiar challenge settling over me. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of demonstrating professional competence or defending strategic recommendations. This was about something far more fundamental and far more difficult to overcome. I was about to discover that in the world of ultra-luxury retail, where perception shaped reality and image determined value, even the most impressive credentials and innovative ideas couldn't always overcome the persistent power of unconscious bias. The real test wasn't going to be whether Isabella respected my intelligence or appreciated our strategic insights. The real test was whether she could imagine someone who looked like me, representing her brand to the kind of customers who spent $50,000 on a single shopping trip. The lunch meeting never happened. As we approached the elevator to return to the third floor, Isabella's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent message. She glanced at the screen, and I watched her expression shift from polite professionalism to something that looked almost like relief. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "There's been an unexpected development with our Paris suppliers that requires immediate attention. Marcus, we'll need to reschedule the remainder of our meeting." Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "Isabella, this is the first I'm hearing about any supplier issues." Is there something I should? It's a design matter, she cut him off smoothly. Nothing that requires financial oversight at this stage. Dr. Washington, thank you for your time today. Marcus will be in touch about next steps. The dismissal was so swift and final that it took a moment to register what had actually happened. One moment we were preparing to conclude our tour and move into the detailed contract discussions that would seal our partnership. The next moment I was being efficiently escorted toward the exit like a visitor whose welcome had expired. But something in Isabella's tone, in the way she avoided making eye contact, in the careful distance she maintained as we walked toward the store's entrance, told me that this wasn't really about supplier issues. This was about something else entirely. Perhaps we could reschedule for later this week? I suggested, maintaining my professional demeanor even as alarm bells were ringing in my head. I'm available any day that works for your schedule. Marcus will coordinate the scheduling, Isabella replied, her voice carrying the kind of finality that brooked no argument. Thank you again for your presentation. It was very educational. The word educational landed like a subtle slap. Not impressive, not compelling. Not the kind of strategic partnership that could transform Meridian Couture's market position. Educational. The kind of polite dismissal reserved for academic exercises that had no practical application in the real world. As we reached the main floor, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with unease. Near the entrance, a small group of sales associates had gathered, ostensibly organizing a display of silk scarves, but clearly paying attention to our conversation. Among them was Jennifer, the jewelry specialist we had met during our tour, and two other women I didn't recognize. All three were watching the interaction with the kind of interest that suggested our meeting had been a topic of discussion throughout the store. Actually, Isabella said, stopping just before we reached the entrance, there is one more thing we should address. She turned to face me directly for the first time since we had left her office, and what I saw in her expression made my pulse quicken. Gone was any pretense of professional courtesy. Her pale green eyes had hardened into something approaching hostility, and her carefully composed features had settled into the kind of look that people wear when they're about to deliver news that no one wants to hear. Dr. Washington, I want to be perfectly clear about something. Meridian Couture has built its reputation over 7 decades by maintaining very specific standards, not just for our merchandise, but for our entire brand experience. Our customers come here because they know exactly what to expect. They expect a certain level of service, a certain atmosphere, a certain aesthetic. The pause before aesthetic was deliberate and loaded with meaning. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly sensing that the conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. I'm not sure I understand, I said, though I was beginning to understand all too clearly. Isabella's smile was sharp and utterly without warmth. Our clientele is very particular about the environment in which they conduct their business. They value tradition, elegance, and a sense of continuity with established standards. I'm not sure that a partnership with your firm would align with the image we've worked so hard to cultivate. The words hit me like a physical blow. After months of preparation, after developing innovative strategies specifically for their business, after demonstrating exactly the kind of cutting-edge thinking that could revolutionize their market position, I was dismissed not because of my ideas but because of who I was. Isabella, Marcus interjected, his voice tight with confusion. I'm not sure what you mean. Dr. Washington's firm has an outstanding reputation, and their strategic recommendations are exactly what we discussed in our planning sessions. Marcus, I appreciate your enthusiasm for new approaches, Isabella replied, her tone carrying just enough condescension to make it clear that she considered his judgment flawed. But there are aspects of brand management that go beyond financial projections and market analysis. Sometimes preserving what we've built requires making difficult decisions about what we can't afford to risk. The conversation was happening around me, but I felt like I was watching it from a great distance. This was a moment I had encountered before in various forms throughout my career. The moment when professional qualifications collided with social prejudice, when excellence was deemed less important than comfort, when innovation was rejected, not because it wouldn't work, but because it came from someone who didn't fit the expected image. With all due respect, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building inside me, my qualifications and the quality of my work should speak for themselves. The success stories I've shared with you, the strategic frameworks we've developed, the financial projections we've provided, None of that changes based on your customer's expectations about what a consultant should look like. Isabella's expression shifted from hostile to something approaching disgust, as if I had committed some breach of etiquette by directly addressing what we all knew was happening. Dr. Washington, I don't think you understand the realities of our business. Our customers invest significant amounts of money in their relationship with Meridian Couture. They expect to work with people who understand their world, who share their values, who can relate to their lifestyle and priorities. I'm simply not confident that you can provide that level of connection. The euphemisms were so transparent they were almost insulting. Share their values, relate to their lifestyle, understand their world. What she meant, of course, was that her customers expected to work with people who looked like them, who came from their background, who wouldn't challenge their assumptions about who belonged in their exclusive spaces. You're making assumptions about my background and my ability to connect with high-net-worth clients that aren't supported by my track record, I replied, my professional composure beginning to crack. I've successfully consulted for luxury brands across the country, working directly with clientele whose investment in our services far exceeded what you're considering. The idea that I can't relate to your customers is both inaccurate and, frankly, insulting. The small group of sales associates had stopped even pretending to work on their display. They were openly watching the confrontation now, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable embarrassment to something that looked almost like satisfaction. I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the instant I walked through Meridian Couture's front doors. Isabella hadn't decided to reject our proposal because of supplier issues or scheduling conflicts. She had decided the moment she saw me in the context of her precious retail environment. I think we're done here, Isabella said, her voice carrying the kind of dismissive finality that people use when they consider a conversation over regardless of whether the other party agrees. Marcus, please see Dr. Washington out. I have calls to return. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Actually, Isabella, I think there's something you need to understand. My voice had found a new register. Still professional, still controlled, but with an edge that made both Isabella and Marcus look at me more sharply. You seem to be operating under the assumption that this decision is entirely yours to make. Isabella's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Clearly she wasn't accustomed to having her dismissals challenged. I'm sorry, she said, the question mark in her tone suggesting that she couldn't quite believe I was continuing a conversation she had declared over. You've made some interesting assumptions about what this meeting represents, I continued, opening my briefcase and pulling out a document I had hoped I wouldn't need to reference. You seem to think that I came here as a supplicant, hoping for your approval to work with Meridian Couture. But you might want to review the preliminary agreements that Marcus and I executed 6 weeks ago. Marcus's face went pale as he realized what document I was holding. Isabella looked between us with growing confusion and the first hints of alarm. What preliminary agreements? She demanded. The exclusivity clause, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella, I told you about this. Dr. Washington's firm required exclusivity provisions before they would invest time in developing customized strategies for our business. Isabella snatched the document from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal language with growing horror. What she was reading was a standard contract provision that my lawyer had insisted on including in all of our high-level consulting agreements. In exchange for developing proprietary strategies specifically for a client's business, Washington Strategic Consulting retained exclusive rights to those strategies within the luxury retail sector for a period of 2 years. More importantly, if a client chose not to proceed with implementation after we had developed customized solutions, they were contractually obligated to compensate us for the full value of the work, plus additional penalties for breach of good faith negotiations. This can't be legal, Isabella said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was clearly reading language that her own legal team would have immediately recognized as enforceable. It's completely legal, I replied. It's also standard practice in strategic consulting when proprietary methodologies are being adapted for specific clients. You've had access to our heritage experience model, our digital concierge framework, and our complete market analysis for Meridian Couture's expansion opportunities. Those strategies now cannot be implemented by any other luxury retailer for the next 24 months, and if you choose not to proceed, you owe us the full consulting fee plus breach penalties. Isabella's hands were shaking slightly as she continued reading. The document was clear and comprehensive, and I could see her calculating the financial implications of what she was seeing. How much? She asked, her voice barely audible. $1.8 million, I replied, plus legal fees if we have to enforce collection. The number hit the small group like a physical blow. Marcus looked sick. Isabella looked like she was seeing me clearly for the first time since our meeting began. The sales associates who had been enjoying the spectacle of my dismissal suddenly found other places to be. You can't be serious, Isabella whispered. I'm completely serious, I replied. You've spent the last hour demonstrating that you don't believe someone who looks like me belongs in your store, regardless of my qualifications or the quality of my work. That's your right. But it's going to be an expensive lesson in the difference between personal prejudice and professional consequences. For the first time since I had met her, Isabella Meridian Rothschild looked uncertain. The polished confidence that had defined every interaction was cracking, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. We can discuss this, she said, her voice losing its earlier authority. Perhaps we can find a compromise that works for everyone. I'm sure we can, I replied, closing my briefcase with a decisive snap. My assistant will be in touch to schedule a follow-up meeting. And Isabella, next time we meet, you might want to check your assumptions at the door. They're about to become very expensive. The walk from Meridian Couture's Fifth Avenue entrance to my office in Midtown Manhattan took exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes during which my phone buzzed incessantly with messages I chose to ignore. 17 minutes during which I could feel the adrenaline of confrontation gradually transforming into the cold, calculating focus that had built my business from nothing into a seven-figure consulting firm. By the time I reached my office building, I had already mapped out the next 48 hours in precise detail. This wasn't going to be about revenge or personal satisfaction. This was going to be about demonstrating that in the modern business world, prejudice had become a luxury that even luxury brands couldn't afford. My office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower that offered commanding views of Manhattan's business district. The space had been designed to project exactly the right combination of success, sophistication, and innovation. The kind of environment where Fortune 500 executives felt comfortable discussing multi-million-dollar strategies, while my team worked their magic on algorithms that could predict market trends with frightening accuracy. Emergency meeting in the conference room now, I announced as I walked through our reception area. My assistant, David Chen, no relation to Marcus, despite the shared surname, immediately began sending messages to my core team while I headed straight for the secure server room where we maintained our most sensitive client data. Within 15 minutes, my key strategists were assembled around the polished oak conference table that had witnessed countless strategy sessions over the past 3 years. Sarah Martinez, my lead data analyst, had already pulled up multiple screens displaying real-time market information. James Patterson, our legal specialist, was reviewing contract files on his tablet. And Lisa Thompson, our client relations director, was prepared with detailed profiles of every major luxury retailer in North America. We have a situation, I began, settling into my chair at the head of the table. Meridian Couture has decided that our services don't align with their brand image. They're about to learn what that decision is going to cost them. I walked my team through the morning's events in clinical detail, focusing on the strategic implications rather than the personal humiliation. My team had worked with me long enough to understand that when I spoke in that particular tone, calm, precise, and utterly focused, we were moving into what they had come to call scorched earth mode. Sarah, I need a complete competitive analysis of Meridian Couture's market position within 6 hours, I said. Revenue trends, customer demographics, market share data, and most importantly, vulnerabilities. What are their competitors doing that they're not? Where are they losing ground? What opportunities are they missing? Sarah nodded, her fingers already flying across her keyboard. I'll have preliminary data within 2 hours, and a comprehensive analysis by the end of day. James, I want you to review every aspect of our contract with Meridian Couture, not just the exclusivity clause. Everything. What are our rights? What are their obligations? If this goes to litigation, I want to be prepared for any argument their lawyers might raise. James was already making notes. The contract is solid, but I'll do a line-by-line review to identify any potential ambiguities they might try to exploit. Lisa, this is where it gets interesting. I want you to compile a list of every major luxury retailer that would benefit from the strategies we developed for Meridian Couture. Focus on their direct competitors, brands that serve the same clientele but might be more progressive in their approach to partnerships. Lisa's eyes lit up with understanding. You want to offer Meridian's customized strategies to their competitors. Exactly. The exclusivity clause prevents any luxury retailer from implementing our recommendations for the next 24 months, unless Meridian Couture breaches their contract. If they refuse to proceed with good faith negotiations, those strategies become available to anyone willing to pay for them. The room fell silent as my team absorbed the implications of what I was proposing. In the luxury retail world, competitive advantage was everything. An innovative strategy that could increase revenue by 40% wasn't just valuable. It was potentially devastating to competitors who didn't have access to similar insights. How many of Meridian's competitors would be interested in strategies specifically designed to outmaneuver them? I asked. All of them, Lisa replied without hesitation. Bergdorf Goodman, Saks, Neiman Marcus, even some of the emerging luxury boutiques that are trying to establish themselves in major markets. If we're talking about proven strategies that could give them a significant advantage over Meridian Couture, we could have a bidding war on our hands. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, I said. David, I need you to clear my calendar for the rest of the week. Cancel everything that isn't absolutely critical. Sarah, once you have that competitive analysis, I want you to start developing modified versions of our Meridian strategies that could be customized for their top 3 competitors. My phone buzzed with another message. This time I glanced at the screen. Marcus Chen, again. His 5th attempt to reach me in the past hour. Actually, let's pause for a moment, I said. I think it's time to take this call. I activated the conference room's speaker system and dialed Marcus's number. He answered on the first ring. Simone, thank God. His voice filled the room, tight with stress and desperation. We need to talk. Isabella, there's been a misunderstanding. I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all, I replied calmly. Your creative director made her position very clear. My firm doesn't align with Meridian Couture's brand image. I respect her decision. That's not, look, can we meet? Not at the store, somewhere neutral. I think if we sit down and discuss this rationally, we can find a solution that works for everyone. I could hear the panic in his voice. Marcus was clearly beginning to understand the financial implications of Isabella's prejudice, and he was scrambling to contain a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. Marcus, I'm curious about something, I said. When you and Isabella discussed my preliminary presentations over the past 6 weeks, did she ever express concerns about my qualifications or the quality of my work? The pause that followed was answer enough. Not specifically, he said finally, but she did ask some questions about whether our clientele would be comfortable with. With what exactly? Another pause. Working with consultants from non-traditional backgrounds. My team exchanged glances around the conference table. We were all hearing the same thing. Confirmation that Isabella's rejection had nothing to do with professional competence and everything to do with racial prejudice that Marcus had been aware of and failed to address. So you knew this was a possibility, I said. You knew that Isabella might reject our proposal based on her assumptions about how your customers would react to working with a black consultant. It wasn't like that, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isabella is just very protective of the brand. She's not prejudiced. She just thinks about these things differently. I see. And how does she think about the $1.8 million penalty that she's now obligated to pay for breaching our agreement in bad faith? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Marcus, are you still there? We can't pay that, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Simone, you have to understand, that kind of penalty would be devastating to our quarterly numbers. The board Isabella would what? Lose her job? Face consequences for allowing personal prejudice to override sound business judgment? That sounds like an internal matter for Meridian Couture to resolve. Please, Marcus said, and I could hear genuine desperation in his voice now. Let me talk to Isabella. Let me explain the situation. Maybe there's a way we can move forward with the partnership. I'm sure there is, I replied, but the terms have changed. The original proposal assumed good faith negotiations and mutual professional respect. Since those assumptions have proven incorrect, we'll need to adjust our approach accordingly. What do you mean? I glanced around the conference room at my team. all of whom were listening intently to the conversation that was about to reshape Meridian Couture's future. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. You're going to schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, not at your store, at my office. Isabella is going to attend, along with whatever legal counsel she feels she needs to bring. We're going to renegotiate our partnership agreement under new terms that reflect the actual dynamics of this relationship. What kind of new terms? First, our consulting fee is now $3 million instead of $1.2 million. The additional cost reflects the risk premium for working with a client who has demonstrated unreliable judgment. Marcus made a sound that might have been a groan or a gasp. Second, the engagement will now include mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all senior management and client-facing staff. This training will be conducted by specialists I select at Meridian Couture's expense. Isabella will never agree to that. Then she'll pay the breach penalty instead. Third, our partnership agreement will include specific clauses regarding professional respect and non-discrimination. Any future attempts to dismiss or marginalize my team based on racial or cultural assumptions will result in immediate termination of the contract and additional financial penalties. The silence on Marcus's end was deafening. Fourth, Meridian Couture will publicly announce our partnership and specifically highlight our firm's role in their strategic expansion plans. This announcement will include recognition of our expertise and the innovative approaches we're bringing to luxury retail. Simone, these terms are expensive? Humiliating? Inconvenient? Yes, they are. They're also the cost of allowing prejudice to override professional judgment. Marcus, let me be very clear about something. Your creative director spent the morning treating me like an unwelcome intruder in a world where I don't belong. She's about to discover that in the modern business environment, that kind of thinking doesn't just make you a bad person, it makes you a liability to your shareholders. I could hear Marcus whispering to someone in the background, presumably updating Isabella on the new reality they were facing. There's one more thing, I continued. If Isabella chooses to reject these terms and pay the breach penalty instead, I want you to understand what happens next. The strategies we developed specifically for Meridian Couture will become available to your competitors. Within 90 days, your biggest rivals will be implementing market expansion plans, customer experience innovations, and digital strategies that were designed to give you a competitive advantage. Isabella's prejudice won't just cost you $1.8 million, it'll cost you your market position. The conversation concluded with Marcus promising to relay my terms to Isabella and confirm the meeting time within 2 hours. After I hung up, my team sat in contemplative silence for several moments. That was brutal, Sarah said finally. That was business, I corrected. Isabella Meridian Rothschild is about to learn that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's economically stupid. In today's market, prejudice is a luxury that even luxury brands can't afford. James looked up from his legal pad where he had been taking notes throughout the call. What if they choose to pay the penalty rather than accept the new terms? I smiled, and it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. Then we moved to phase 2. Lisa, how quickly could we get meetings scheduled with the executive teams at Bergdorf Goodman, Sachs, and Neiman Marcus? If we position it as a competitive intelligence opportunity, probably within 48 hours. Perfect. Because if Meridian Couture thinks they can dismiss me and walk away unscathed, they're about to discover just how expensive that assumption is going to be. The next morning, Isabella Meridian Rothschild arrived at my office looking like a woman who had spent the night staring at financial projections that could destroy her career. Gone was the polished confidence I had witnessed the day before. In its place was something I had never expected to see from someone of her stature. Genuine fear. She entered my conference room flanked by 2 attorneys from what I recognized as one of Manhattan's most expensive legal firms. The lead counsel, a distinguished man in his 60s named Harrison Webb, carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to making problems disappear for wealthy clients. The second attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, was already reviewing documents on her tablet before she had even taken her seat. Marcus Chen looked like he hadn't slept at all. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, wrinkled shirt, loosened tie, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from spending hours trying to explain to a board of directors how a routine business meeting had evolved into a potential 8-figure liability. Dr. Washington, Harrison Webb began without preamble, My client believes there may have been some misunderstandings yesterday that we can resolve through reasonable discussion. I smiled politely and gestured to the seats across from me. My own legal counsel, Patricia Williams from Williams & Associates, was already seated to my right, her own stack of documents organized with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment since 6 o'clock that morning. "I appreciate your optimism, Mr. Webb," I replied, "but I'm not sure there were any misunderstandings. Your client made her position very clear. She doesn't believe that someone with my background can represent Meridian Couture's brand effectively. I respect her opinion. I'm simply asking her to pay for the privilege of holding it." Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Up close, I could see the toll that 24 hours of crisis management had taken on her. The perfectly composed executive I had met the day before had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely rattled. "Dr. Washington," she said, her voice carrying none of yesterday's authority, "I think you may have misinterpreted my concerns about the partnership. My questions weren't about your qualifications. They were about strategic fit between our organizations." "Interesting," I replied, opening the folder in front of me. "Because I have here the transcript of the conversation you had with Marcus 6 weeks ago, when you first learned that Washington Strategic Consulting would be led by a black woman. Would you like me to read some of your specific comments about cultural alignment and your concerns about how your customers would react to working with consultants from urban backgrounds?" The color drained from Isabella's face. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Even Harrison Webb appeared taken aback by the directness of my statement. "How do you have a transcript of a private conversation?" Webb demanded. Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Chen recorded the conversation as part of his standard due diligence process when evaluating potential partnerships. It's referenced in the preliminary agreement that both parties signed, all quite legal and properly disclosed." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Isabella had been operating under the assumption that her prejudiced comments had been private discussions that could never be proven. The reality that her discriminatory reasoning was documented and legally admissible was clearly a devastating blow to any defense strategy her attorneys had been developing. "Let's cut to the chase," I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from holding all the cards in a negotiation. "Ms. Meridian Rothschild, you have two choices. You can accept the revised partnership terms I outlined yesterday, or you can pay the breach penalty and watch your competitors implement strategies that were specifically designed to outmaneuver your business." "The revised terms are unreasonable," Webb protested. $3 million for a consulting engagement that was originally priced at $1.2 million, mandatory diversity training, public announcements highlighting your firm's role. These demands are punitive, not compensatory." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "They are punitive. They're designed to ensure that discrimination against qualified professionals becomes so expensive that even people with unconscious bias think twice before acting on their prejudices." Isabella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we proceed with the original partnership terms? Could we put this misunderstanding behind us and move forward professionally?" I studied her face carefully. There was desperation there, but also something else. A calculating quality that suggested she was still looking for ways to minimize the consequences of her actions. "I'm afraid that's no longer an option," I replied. "You see, Isabella, yesterday's interaction revealed something important about your character and judgment. You allowed personal bias to override sound business decisions. That kind of thinking doesn't just affect me. It represents a fundamental risk to any partnership we might have." Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "Simone, surely we can find some middle ground here. Isabella has acknowledged that there were communication issues yesterday. Can't we view this as a learning opportunity and move forward?" "Marcus, let me ask you something," I said, turning to face him directly. "How long have you known that Isabella had concerns about working with consultants from non-traditional backgrounds?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions as he realized that any answer he gave would either implicate him in Isabella's discrimination or reveal that he had failed to protect his company from legal liability. There were some general discussions about cultural fit," he said finally, "but I never thought." "You never thought she would actually act on those biases," I finished for him, "but she did. And now you're both learning that in the modern business environment, discrimination isn't just morally wrong. It's financially catastrophic." Patricia slid a document across the table to Harrison Webb. These are the revised partnership terms that Dr. Washington outlined yesterday, along with some additional provisions that we've added based on our review of the situation. Webb skimmed the document, his expression growing increasingly grim. Additional provisions? Personal liability clauses for executives who engage in discriminatory practices, Patricia explained matter-of-factly. If any member of Meridian Couture's leadership team attempts to undermine the partnership based on racial, gender, or cultural bias, they become personally responsible for financial damages, not just the corporation. Isabella's face went white. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious," I replied. "Yesterday, you tried to dismiss me because you didn't think someone who looks like me belongs in your store. Today, you're going to sign a contract that makes you personally liable if you ever act on those kinds of assumptions again." Harrison Webb was reading the document more carefully now, his frown deepening with each page. "These terms are extraordinary. I'm not sure my client can agree to personal liability provisions of this magnitude." "Then she can pay the breach penalty instead," I said with a shrug. "But let me be clear about what happens if she chooses that option." I nodded to Sarah Martinez, who activated the large display screen at the front of the conference room. Immediately, the screen filled with detailed market analysis charts, competitive positioning data, and financial projections that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "This is what we've learned about Meridian Couture's market position in the past 18 hours, I began, using a laser pointer to highlight specific data points. "Your revenue growth has slowed significantly over the past 2 years. Your customer base is aging, and you're failing to attract the next generation of luxury consumers. Your competitors are gaining market share in key demographics, particularly among affluent professionals between the ages of 28 and 45. Isabella was staring at the screen with a mixture of horror and fascination. The data we were displaying was clearly more comprehensive and accurate than anything her internal team had developed. "More importantly," I continued, advancing to the next slide, "we've identified 17 specific strategic opportunities that could reverse these trends and position Meridian Couture for sustained growth over the next decade. These opportunities are currently protected by our exclusivity agreement." The next slide showed a timeline that made Marcus audibly gasp. "If Isabella chooses to pay the breach penalty rather than proceed with our partnership, these strategies become available to your competitors within 90 days. Bergdorf Goodman has already expressed interest in our Heritage Artisan Program concept. Saks wants to discuss our digital concierge platform. Neiman Marcus is intrigued by our experiential authenticity framework." "You contacted our competitors?" Isabella asked, her voice rising with alarm. "I had preliminary conversations to gauge interest," I replied calmly, "all completely legal and appropriate. The question is, would you rather implement these strategies yourself or watch your biggest rivals use them to capture your market share?" Sarah advanced to the final slide, which showed financial projections that made the entire room fall silent. "If Meridian Couture proceeds with our revised partnership, our models predict revenue increases of 67% over the next 3 years. If your competitors implement these strategies instead, our models predict that Meridian Couture will lose approximately 35% of its current market share within 18 months. The numbers were devastating and irrefutable. Isabella was looking at data that showed exactly how much her prejudice was going to cost her company, presented with the kind of precision that made argument impossible. "How do we know these projections are accurate?" Harrison Webb asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Because we've successfully implemented similar strategies for luxury brands across multiple markets," Patricia replied, sliding another folder across the table. "These are case studies and verified results from 12 different luxury retail partnerships over the past 4 years. Dr. Washington's firm has a track record of exceeding their projections by an average of 23%. Isabella buried her face in her hands. For several moments, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. When she finally looked up, I could see that something fundamental had shifted in her expression. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said quietly. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that your prejudices nearly cost your company millions of dollars and your employees their jobs," I replied. "I'm asking you to sign a contract that holds you personally accountable for discriminatory behavior. And I'm asking you to publicly recognize that diverse perspectives and innovative thinking are assets, not liabilities, in the modern business world." Isabella looked around the room, at her expensive attorneys who couldn't make this problem disappear, at Marcus, who had failed to protect her from her own biases, at the financial projections that showed exactly what her discrimination was going to cost. "If I sign this contract," she said finally, "what guarantee do I have that this won't happen again? That you won't use this situation to extract additional concessions in the future?" It was a fair question, and I could see that she was finally beginning to think like a businesswoman rather than someone driven by unconscious prejudice. "Isabella, let me be very clear about something," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I don't want to destroy your business. I want to transform it. The strategies we've developed aren't just about increasing your revenue. They're about creating a luxury retail experience that serves all customers with excellence, regardless of their background or appearance." I gestured toward the display screen, which still showed the financial projections that had stunned everyone in the room. "These numbers represent what happens when businesses embrace innovation instead of clinging to outdated assumptions. When you create inclusive environments that welcome diverse perspectives, you don't just become more ethical, you become more profitable." Isabella stared at the contract in front of her for nearly 5 minutes before reaching for a pen. As she signed each page, I could see her transformation from someone driven by prejudice to someone forced to confront the cost of discrimination. "When do we start?" she asked finally, her voice carrying a mixture of resignation and, surprisingly, what sounded like genuine curiosity. "We start now," I replied. "And Isabella, welcome to the future of luxury retail." 6 months later, I stood in the private viewing suite on Meridian Couture's newly redesigned 4th floor, watching something I had never thought I would see in my lifetime. The Heritage Artisan Program's inaugural exhibition was in full swing, and the transformed space buzzed with an energy that felt fundamentally different from the sterile exclusivity I had encountered on that October morning. Master craftsmen from 7 different countries were demonstrating their techniques in glass-walled ateliers that had been installed throughout the floor. In one corner, Elena Vasquez, a 3rd-generation leather artisan from Valencia, was hand-stitching a custom handbag while explaining the historical significance of each technique to a rapt audience of customers. Near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, Philippe Dubois, a master watchmaker from Geneva, was assembling the intricate mechanisms of a bespoke timepiece while discussing the mathematical precision required for each component. But what struck me most wasn't the technical mastery on display, it was the diversity of the audience. The customers participating in these educational experiences represented a cross-section of New York's affluent community that would have been unimaginable in the old Meridian Couture. Young tech entrepreneurs sat beside established Wall Street executives. International business leaders engaged in animated discussions with local cultural influencers. Multi-generational families explored craftsmanship traditions together, with grandparents sharing stories of their own cultural heritage while teenagers learned about artisan techniques they had never encountered. "The transformation has been remarkable," said a voice beside me. I turned to see Dr. Angela Morrison, the diversity and inclusion specialist I had brought in to lead Meridian Couture's mandatory training program. Angela was a brilliant psychologist who specialized in unconscious bias in luxury retail environments, and her work with Isabella's team had exceeded even my optimistic expectations. "How has Isabella been adjusting to the changes?" I asked, watching the creative director move through the crowd with an enthusiasm I wouldn't have believed possible 6 months earlier. Angela smiled, following my gaze to where Isabella was deep in conversation with a young black entrepreneur who was commissioning a custom jewelry piece for his company's upcoming IPO celebration. "It's been fascinating to observe, honestly. She's someone who clearly has strong aesthetic instincts and genuine passion for craftsmanship. Once we helped her recognize how her unconscious biases were limiting her vision, she embraced the broader possibilities with remarkable enthusiasm." The transformation had indeed been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. The first month of our partnership had been tense, marked by careful politeness and obvious discomfort, as Isabella struggled to reconcile her previous assumptions with the reality of working closely with my team. The mandatory training sessions had been particularly challenging, forcing her to confront not just her conscious attitudes but the deeper, more insidious forms of bias that had shaped her professional decisions for years. But somewhere around the 8-week mark, something had clicked. Isabella had begun asking genuine questions instead of going through the motions of compliance. She started seeking out diverse perspectives instead of merely tolerating them. Most importantly, she began recognizing how her previous limitations had actually constrained her creative vision and business opportunities. The financial results spoke for themselves. Meridian Couture's revenue had increased by 73% in the first 6 months of our partnership, exceeding even our most optimistic projections. More significantly, they had attracted over 2,000 new customers from demographics they had never successfully reached before, while maintaining complete satisfaction among their traditional clientele. The Heritage Artisan program had become the cornerstone of their transformation. Rather than simply selling luxury goods, Meridian Couture now offered something unique in the retail landscape: genuine education about craftsmanship traditions, personal connections with master artisans, and the opportunity to participate in the creation process itself. Customers weren't just buying products. They were investing in stories, traditions, and the continuation of cultural heritage. The digital concierge platform had proven equally successful, though in ways we hadn't initially anticipated. Rather than simply facilitating remote shopping, it had become a sophisticated cultural network that connected customers with similar interests, provided access to exclusive educational content, and offered personalized recommendations based on individual taste and cultural background. The platform now had a waiting list of over 5,000 potential members, each willing to undergo a detailed application process for the privilege of accessing Meridian Couture's expanded services. But perhaps the most significant transformation had been in the store's culture itself. The staff training program had evolved far beyond a basic diversity awareness to become a comprehensive education in cultural competency, global luxury traditions, and inclusive customer service. Sales associates were now trained not just to recognize expensive merchandise, but to appreciate the diverse cultural contexts that shaped different customers' relationships with luxury consumption. I watched Jennifer, the jewelry specialist I had met on that first disastrous tour, as she worked with a customer from Lagos who was selecting pieces that would honor both his Nigerian heritage and his new life as a Manhattan-based investment banker. The conversation was rich with cultural nuance, historical context, and genuine respect for the customer's complex identity. 6 months earlier, such an interaction would have been impossible in this space. "Simone," Isabella's voice interrupted my observations. She approached the customer she had been advising, the young entrepreneur I had noticed earlier. "I'd like you to meet Jordan Williams. He's the founder of NextGen Innovations, and he's commissioning a custom piece to commemorate his company's public offering next month." Jordan extended his hand with a smile that immediately revealed his intelligence and ambition. "Dr. Washington, it's an honor to meet you. Isabella has been telling me about the work your firm has done to transform this space. As someone who's spent years fighting to be taken seriously in predominantly white business environments, I have to say, this is exactly what luxury retail should look like." The conversation that followed illustrated everything our partnership had accomplished. Jordan shared his story of building an artificial intelligence company from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise, facing skepticism and dismissal at every stage because investors couldn't imagine a young black man from Detroit leading a cutting-edge tech firm. Isabella listened with genuine engagement, asking thoughtful questions and making connections between his experiences and the craftsmanship traditions represented in the Heritage Artisan program. "What strikes me most," Jordan said as we concluded our conversation, "is how this space makes excellence accessible without diminishing its value. I've been in plenty of luxury environments where I felt like I had to prove I belonged there. Here, the assumption is that if you appreciate quality and craftsmanship, you belong, period." After Jordan left to continue exploring the exhibition, Isabella and I found ourselves alone for the first time since the contract signing 6 months earlier. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest discussion we had ever had. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, "not just for how I treated you that day, but for how my thinking limited what this business could become." I studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the calculated politeness that had marked our early interactions. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine humility mixed with excitement about the possibilities ahead. "Isabella, what matters isn't the apology, it's what you've learned from the experience," I replied. "The question is, how do you make sure you never make those kinds of assumptions again?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the diverse crowd of customers, artisans, and staff members who filled the transformed space. "I think the key is remembering that excellence comes from unexpected places. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what luxury customers looked like, what they wanted, how they made decisions. I was wrong about almost everything." "Not wrong," I corrected. "Limited. Your instincts about quality and craftsmanship were always sound. You just hadn't recognized how many different kinds of people share those values. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus Chen, who approached with a tablet displaying real-time sales data from the Heritage Artisan exhibition. His smile was so wide, it threatened to split his face. "You need to see this," he said, practically vibrating with excitement. "We've generated more revenue in the past 4 hours than we typically see in an entire week. But more importantly, we have customers scheduling follow-up appointments, requesting custom commissions, and asking about membership in our cultural education programs." The data he showed us was remarkable, but what impressed me most was the qualitative feedback from customers. The comments weren't just about purchasing luxury goods. They were about feeling inspired, educated, and connected to something larger than themselves. "This is what happens when you expand your definition of who your customers can be," I said. "You don't just increase your market share, you create an entirely new category of luxury experience." As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 6 months earlier, I had walked into Meridian Couture, expecting a straightforward business negotiation. Instead, I had encountered prejudice so blatant that it had forced me to choose between accepting dismissal or fighting for something bigger than a single consulting contract. The choice to fight had transformed not just Meridian Couture, but my own understanding of what was possible when businesses genuinely committed to change. The mandatory training, the revised partnership terms, the personal liability clauses, all of these had been designed as punitive measures to ensure compliance. But what had emerged was something far more valuable, a genuine transformation in how Isabella and her team thought about excellence, diversity, and customer service. The success of our partnership had also transformed Washington Strategic Consulting. Word of the Meridian Couture project had spread quickly through the luxury retail industry, and we now had waiting lists of brands eager to undergo similar transformations. We had been forced to expand our team, develop new training programs, and create frameworks for organizational change that went far beyond traditional consulting services. But the most significant transformation had been personal. The experience had forced me to confront my own assumptions about what was possible when facing institutional prejudice. I had always believed that excellence would eventually be recognized and rewarded. The Meridian Couture project had taught me that sometimes you have to fight for that recognition, and that the fight itself could create opportunities for change that exceeded anything you had originally imagined. As the exhibition evening wound down and the last customers made their way toward the elevators, I found myself in conversation with several of the master artisans who had participated in the program. Their perspectives on the transformation were particularly illuminating. "In 40 years of practicing my craft," said Elena Vasquez, the leather artisan from Valencia, "I have never worked in an environment that celebrated both tradition and innovation the way this does. When I first arrived, I was concerned about whether American customers would appreciate traditional Spanish techniques. Instead, I found customers from dozens of different cultural backgrounds, all eager to learn about craftsmanship traditions they had never encountered." Philippe Dubois, the Swiss watchmaker, nodded in agreement. "What impresses me most is the sophistication of the questions customers ask. They understand that they're not just purchasing objects. They're participating in the continuation of cultural traditions. That level of engagement elevates both the craftsmanship and the customer experience." The conversation reminded me of something my grandmother had said years earlier, during one of our discussions about breaking barriers and creating change. "Simone," she had told me, "sometimes you have to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Sometimes you have to make it so expensive to discriminate that people choose inclusion instead." At the time, I had thought she was being overly dramatic. Now, watching the thriving, diverse community that had emerged from what began as a confrontation over prejudice, I understood exactly what she had meant. The evening concluded with an impromptu celebration in Isabella's private dining room. The gathering included not just the Meridian Couture team and the visiting artisans, but several customers who had become genuine friends of the business, members of my consulting team, and even Jordan Williams, who had decided to extend his visit to learn more about the Heritage Artisan program. As we raised glasses to toast the success of the exhibition, Isabella asked for a moment to address the group. What she said surprised everyone, including me. 6 months ago, I thought I understood what luxury meant," she began. "I thought it was about exclusivity, about maintaining traditions, about serving customers who already understood and appreciated what we offered. I was wrong about almost everything." She paused, looking around the room at the diverse group of people who had helped transform her business and, clearly, her understanding of what was possible. What I've learned is that real luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about elevating experiences to a level where everyone who encounters them feels inspired to be their best selves. It's about creating spaces where excellence is celebrated regardless of where it comes from or who embodies it. The toast that followed felt like more than a celebration of business success. It felt like recognition of something larger. The possibility that even the most entrenched forms of prejudice could be transformed when people were willing to confront their assumptions and embrace change. But as I reflected on the evening's events during the taxi ride back to my apartment, I found myself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Had I been right to use legal and financial leverage to force change that Isabella might not have chosen voluntarily? Was the transformation we had achieved genuine, or simply the result of economic pressure that left no alternative? The answer, I realized, was probably both. Isabella's change of heart appeared genuine, but it had required external pressure to overcome years of unconscious bias. The diverse, thriving community we had created was real, but it had emerged from a confrontation that could have destroyed careers and businesses if handled differently. More troubling was the question of what would have happened if I hadn't been in a position to fight back. What if I had been a less established consultant, or if Washington Strategic Consulting hadn't had the legal protections and financial resources necessary to challenge discrimination? How many talented professionals had been dismissed from similar situations without the leverage to demand accountability? The thought was sobering, and it reinforced something I had learned throughout my career. Individual success, no matter how significant, wasn't enough to address systemic problems. Real change required not just personal achievement, but the creation of systems and structures that made discrimination economically unsustainable. That realization had led to the next phase of Washington Strategic Consulting's evolution. We were now working with business schools to develop case studies about the Meridian Couture transformation, creating educational programs that helped other consultants recognize and address workplace discrimination, and partnering with legal organizations to ensure that exclusivity clauses and personal liability provisions became standard practice in consulting agreements. We had also established the Rosa Washington Foundation, named for my grandmother, which provided legal and financial support to professionals facing discrimination in high-stakes business environments. The foundation's first grant had gone to a brilliant Latina architect who had been dismissed from a major commercial project after the client decided her aesthetic vision didn't align with their corporate culture. With the foundation's support, she had successfully sued for discrimination and won a settlement that allowed her to establish her own firm. These broader initiatives reflected something I had come to understand about creating lasting change. It wasn't enough to win individual battles against prejudice. Real transformation required changing the economic incentives that allowed discrimination to persist, creating legal frameworks that made bias expensive, and establishing support systems that enabled more people to fight back when they encountered injustice. The Meridian Couture project had become a model for this approach. The success of our partnership had demonstrated that diversity wasn't just morally right, it was economically advantageous. The financial results spoke louder than any moral argument could have, creating a business case for inclusion that other luxury brands couldn't ignore. Within a year of our partnership launch, 3 major luxury retailers had contacted us about similar transformations. 2 had implemented voluntary diversity training programs for their senior staff. 1 had established its own artisan residency program modeled on our Heritage Initiative. All of them recognized that the luxury market was evolving, and that brands that failed to adapt would find themselves increasingly irrelevant. But perhaps the most significant impact had been on individual careers within the luxury retail industry. Several employees from other high-end stores had reached out to share their own stories of workplace discrimination, seeking advice about how to address situations where their professional competence was being questioned based on their race, gender, or cultural background. These conversations reminded me that the Meridian Couture confrontation had been about more than one consulting contract or even one person's prejudices. It had been about something fundamental to the American promise, the idea that talent and hard work should be recognized and rewarded regardless of what you look like or where you come from. The reality, of course, was more complicated. 6 months of transformation couldn't erase decades of institutional bias, and one successful partnership couldn't solve the broader problems of discrimination in business environments. But it had demonstrated something important. When prejudice was confronted directly, systematically, and with sufficient leverage, meaningful change was possible. As I settled into my apartment that evening, reviewing the day's events and planning the next phase of our expansion, I found myself thinking about the young professionals who might benefit from the precedent we had established. The next time a qualified consultant was dismissed because they didn't fit someone's assumptions about what expertise looked like, they would have examples to point to, legal frameworks to reference, and support systems to rely on. They would also have something else, proof that fighting back was not just possible, but potentially transformational for everyone involved. The Meridian Couture project had taught me that confronting discrimination wasn't just about defending individual dignity. It was about creating opportunities for innovation, growth, and excellence that benefited entire organizations and communities. When businesses expanded their definition of who could contribute value, they didn't just become more ethical, they became more successful. This lesson had broader implications that extended far beyond luxury retail. In technology, finance, healthcare, education, and every other sector of the economy, organizations that embraced diverse perspectives and challenged their assumptions about talent were consistently outperforming those that clung to traditional, narrow definitions of expertise. The question wasn't whether diversity initiatives were worth the investment. The data was overwhelmingly clear that they were. The question was whether leaders had the courage to confront their own biases, and the wisdom to recognize that change was both morally necessary and economically advantageous. 6 months after walking out of Meridian Couture as a dismissed consultant, I had returned as a partner in one of the most innovative transformations in luxury retail history. The journey from confrontation to collaboration had been challenging, sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally exhausting. But it had also been proof of something my grandmother had always insisted was true: that excellence, when properly supported and strategically deployed, could overcome even the most entrenched forms of prejudice. The real question now was what would happen next. Would other organizations learn from Meridian Couture's example and proactively embrace change? Would legal frameworks evolve to make discrimination even more expensive? Would young professionals from diverse backgrounds feel empowered to challenge bias when they encountered it? The answers to these questions would determine whether our success represented an isolated victory or the beginning of broader transformation. But one thing was certain: the precedent had been set, the business case had been proven, and the cost of clinging to prejudice had been made crystal clear. As I looked out at the Manhattan skyline from my apartment window, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that October morning when Isabella had first tried to dismiss me. Genuine optimism about what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, when they prioritized excellence over assumptions, and when they recognized that true luxury lay not in exclusion but in the elevation of human potential in all its magnificent diversity. The transformation was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.